Wounded mama bear leads woman to dying cub, but what she finds there. The forest was unusually quiet that morning. No rustling leaves, no bird song, just the faint crunch of frosted grass under heavy boots. Ava Thompson, a seasoned wildlife biologist, had spent over a decade working in the remote Alaskan wilderness, but something about that day felt off. She had received an emergency call from the ranger station, reports of a wounded grizzly wandering close to a hiking path near Devil's Pass. Locals had been warned to stay away, but Ava didn't hesitate. Injured animals weren't just a threat to people. They were often victims of poaching, traps, or worse, and Ava had seen the damage a single forgotten snare could do. By the time she reached the ridge, early light was slicing through the pine, trees in thin golden blades. The air smelled sharp, pine sap, cold earth, and something else, blood. Ava spotted it near a rock outcropping, thick drops, still wet. She crouched to inspect it, eyes narrowing. It wasn't from a kill. There were no signs of struggle or scattered fur. This was something else, something alive and bleeding. Her gloved hand reached for the tranquilizer kit strapped to her side, just in case. Then came the sound, a low, guttural moan, barely above a growl, but filled with pain. Ava turned sharply, eyes scanning the underbrush. From behind a cluster of spruce trees, something massive shifted. Limbs shaking, a large female grizzly emerged. Ava froze. The bear wasn't charging, she wasn't roaring, she wasn't even trying to scare Ava away. She was limping, badly. One of her front legs dragged, unnaturally, and the left side of her thick body was caked in dried blood. Ava should have backed away. Protocol said you never stay close to a wounded predator, especially one that outweighed you by several hundred pounds. But the bear wasn't acting like a threat. In fact, it was the opposite. The grizzly locked eyes with Ava for a brief, chilling moment, and then turned and walked away, limping into the trees. Then she stopped, looked back, waited. It didn't feel random. It felt intentional. Ava's pulse quickened. She had seen this behavior once before, years ago, when a wolf led her away from its den to reveal a snare wound on its mate. Some animals, especially those with high emotional intelligence like wolves, elephants, and bears, behaved in ways science still struggled to explain. But this? A wounded mother bear walking into the woods, looking back as if to say, "Follow." Me? That was new. That was something else. And Ava did follow. Not out of recklessness, not even out of pure curiosity, but because her instincts told her the bear wasn't leading her into danger. She was leading her to something that needed help. The path the bear took wasn't a trail. It was barely even a gap between the trees. Thick branches clawed at Ava's jacket as she moved through the underbrush, trying to keep the wounded animal in sight. The bear moved slowly, every step pained, but still purposeful. She would glance back every few seconds, eyes locking with Ava's as if checking to make sure she was still there. That alone told Ava this wasn't random. The bear wasn't fleeing. She was guiding. After nearly 15 minutes of silence, the forest opened slightly into a small hollow, choked with fallen logs and tangled ferns. The mother bear stopped at the edge of a shallow ravine and let out a low, rumbling sound that wasn't a growl. It was softer, almost a whimper. Then Ava heard it. A faint, high-pitched cry. Not human, not a bird. It was weak and broken, like something trying to call for help, but too far gone to be loud. And that's when Ava saw it. Down at the base of the ravine, partially hidden under a blanket of moss and debris, was a small grizzly cub. It looked no older than 6 or 7 months. Its fur was matted with dirt, one hind leg bent at an unnatural angle. It was barely moving, just shallow breaths, a trembling paw, and the occasional soft cry. Ava's chest tightened. She descended, carefully, keeping her movements slow and calm. The mother bear didn't stop her. She watched from above, panting heavily, her wounded side heaving. That's when Ava noticed the cub wasn't just injured. The area around its rear leg was swollen, dark and twisted, a snare. Thin, rusted metal was still embedded in the skin, cutting off circulation. The injury wasn't fresh. It had been there for days. Ava's hands trembled as she pulled the emergency pack from her shoulder. If they didn't get the snare off, the cub would lose the leg. Or worse, the infection would spread, and it would die here, quietly in the woods, never knowing anything beyond this pain. She moved fast but steady, a clean towel under the cub's body, a gentle injection of mild sedative just enough to calm it. She could feel its tiny heartbeat racing beneath the fur as she whispered softly, as if her voice could soothe it. Okay, I'm here now. Then came the moment of truth. With gloved hands, she reached for the snare, old, crude, and carelessly made. Probably illegal. She hated that more than anything. These traps weren't set by professional wildlife managers. They were the work of careless poachers, or worse, people who thought animals like this didn't matter. Her jaw clenched as she clipped the wire free. The cub let out a sharp cry, then went still, not unconscious, but silent, watching. And then, from the ridge above, the mother bear let out a low exhale, almost like a sigh, a sound that felt heavy with trust. Ava looked up, meeting her eyes. In that moment, no words were exchanged, but something far deeper passed between them. Understanding. As Ava wrapped the cub's leg in a temporary splint, her mind raced with questions. How had this happened? There were no active trap permits in this region, and the ranger station hadn't received any reports of poachers for over a year. Yet this cub had clearly been suffering in silence. Days, maybe longer. And its mother had been watching the whole time, wounded, helpless, and somehow smart enough to lead a human to her child. She finished the wrap and gently lifted the cub, cradling it against her chest. The weight was light, far too light for its age. Malnourished, dehydrated, and weak, she had to move fast. There was no way the cub would survive another night without real care. But just as she turned to climb out of the ravine, something caught her eye, metal glinting beneath a pile of brush about 10 feet away. Ava carefully approached and swept the moss aside. What she saw made her stomach drop. 4 more snares, all of them arranged in a pattern, strategic, hidden under natural debris, the kind of setup someone had taken time to place. Nearby, a thick chain was wrapped around the base of a tree, stained with old blood. This wasn't accidental. Someone had been here, laying traps, maybe even baiting animals, and they hadn't just hurt this cub. They had likely caught others too. She took photos quickly, documenting everything. Time was tight, but evidence like this couldn't be ignored. It meant there were still people out there targeting wildlife in these protected zones. She had to report it immediately, but right now, the cub came first. As Ava reached the edge of the ravine with the cub in her arms, the mother bear stood, waiting. Her breathing was ragged, and she swayed slightly on her feet. Ava stopped a few feet away, uncertain what would happen next. The mother's eyes shifted to the cub, then back to Ava. For a moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she lowered herself onto the ground. Not in submission, not in defeat, but in complete, unspoken trust. It was one of the rarest things Ava had ever witnessed. A wild animal, wounded and protective, laying herself down in front of a human as if to say, "I'm done fighting, just help." And Ava knew what she had to do. She pulled the emergency flare from her belt and fired it into the sky. A single red streak arced overhead, signaling for ranger backup. It would take time, maybe 30 minutes if they moved fast. But Ava stayed put, crouched between the injured cub in her arms and the mother bear, who now lay silent in the clearing, eyes half closed, bleeding and exhausted. All she could do was wait, and hope help would come in time, for both of them. The minutes felt longer than they were. Ava stayed completely still, listening to the steady, uneven breaths of the cub in her arms and the heavier rasping ones of the mother nearby. The bear hadn't moved since lying down. She wasn't sleeping. Ava could see her ears twitching occasionally, reacting to every sound in the woods, but she didn't make a sound or attempt to rise. Her body was simply too worn down. Every few minutes, the cub stirred in Ava's arms, a tiny whimper escaping as it shifted in pain. Ava whispered softly, unsure if the words mattered, but hoping the sound of her voice would be calming. "You're okay now. Just hold on a little longer." 25 minutes passed. Then the crackle of a radio broke the silence. Ava reached for her belt. "This is Ranger Ava Nolan. I've located the injured cub and its mother. I also found multiple illegal snares. Repeat, multiple active traps in violation of federal protection. Coordinates pinged with the flare." The response came through quickly. "Copy that, Ava. Rescue teams 10 minutes out. Bringing medical staff and backup units. Hold your position." Ava exhaled. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the hardest part, waiting alone, was nearly behind her. Then something happened that stopped her heart for a second. The mother bear stirred. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head and looked at Ava. Not past her. Not at the trees. At her. Directly. Ava didn't flinch. She held the gaze, even as her chest tightened. There was something in the bear's eyes that didn't feel like fear or even pain. It felt final. The bear blinked once, slowly, then lowered her head back to the earth. Her breathing slowed again. Ava's instincts kicked in. She checked for signs of trauma and quickly noticed what she had missed earlier. The bear's side had a deep gash, possibly from another trap or sharp rocks, and it was infected, badly. She knew the signs. The infection had spread. Sepsis. The mother had been running on instinct alone, driven by one thing: protecting her cub. Long past the point most animals would collapse, she had fought to find someone, anyone, who could save her baby. And now, with the cub finally safe, her strength was leaving her. Ava swallowed hard and radioed again. Urgent update. Mother, bear is going into septic shock. I need antibiotics and fluids ready on arrival. We may not have much time. The voice on the other end acknowledged her, but it felt far away. Everything in that moment had narrowed down to a single point. This cub. This clearing in the woods, where wild instinct had met human compassion. As the first hum of approaching engines rumbled through the forest, Ava stayed crouched in the middle of it all, one hand on the cub's tiny back, the other resting gently on the mother's thick, matted fur. Neither of them flinched at her touch. She didn't know if they would both survive, but she knew they weren't alone anymore. The sound of tires crunching over forest soil grew louder until two off-road vehicles came into view through the trees. A team of 3 wildlife medics and 2 rangers jumped out, hauling equipment cases with practiced urgency. One of them, Dr. Liam Ortega, a field vet Ava had worked with before, gave her a sharp nod. "Where's the worst of it?" Ava stood, carefully transferring the cub into his arms. "The baby's front leg was caught in a snare. I stabilized it, but it's weak, dehydrated, probably anemic. The mother's worse. Her side is infected, and she's been losing strength fast. Dr." Ortega handed the cub off to a second medic and dropped beside the mother. "We'll need to sedate her lightly to treat the wound. She won't survive full sedation, not in this state." He checked her vitals, while another medic hooked her up to portable fluids and began disinfecting the injury. The rescue team moved, like a well-oiled machine, but Ava couldn't take her eyes off the bear. Even sedated, she flinched every now and then, her instincts fighting against rest, unwilling to let go. Just as Ava was about to turn her attention back to the recovered traps, a young ranger named Ellis approached with a grim expression. "You need to see this," he said, holding out a small plastic bag. Inside was a rusty metal tag. Ava took it, eyebrows furrowed. "Is this from another trap?" "Not just any trap," Ellis said. "It's stamped with an ID, old style. The kind they used to use for sanctioned predator management over a decade ago." Ava's blood ran cold. "That program was shut down. Those traps were supposed to be destroyed." "Exactly," Ellis said. "But whoever left these out here didn't. Just ignore regulations. They knew exactly what they were doing. These weren't poacher snares for fur or sport. This was meant for population control." Ava stared at the tag in her hand, fury building in her chest. "You're saying someone deliberately planted illegal traps in a protected corridor and walked away? Looks like it. And if we hadn't found this cub, if the mother hadn't led you here, it could have gone unnoticed for years." Dr. Ortega stood up, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've stabilized her. She's not out of the woods, figuratively or literally. But if we keep fluids going, she's got a chance." Ava nodded, slipping the tag into her pocket. Her voice was steady, but low. "Then, we're not leaving. Not yet." Later that day, as the sun began to sink behind the trees, Ava and Ellis swept the area. They found 2 more snares, one freshly laid. Whoever was doing this had been active recently, and close. The forest was no longer just a place of natural beauty. It had become a crime scene. But as Ava glanced back to where the cub slept peacefully in a heated carrier, and the mother's chest still rose and fell beside the medic's tent, she felt something stronger than anger: purpose. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It was the beginning of something much bigger. 2 weeks passed. The forest seemed to breathe easier, as if the tension that once clung to every tree had lifted slightly. The mother bear, now named Suri, meaning guardian in an old local dialect, was still recovering in a secure, low-stress wildlife enclosure on the edge of the sanctuary. Her cub, lively and quickly regaining strength, stayed nestled beside her. Despite her lingering weakness, Suri watched everything. Her body had been broken, but her spirit had not. Ava stood outside the reinforced fence, holding a clipboard full of daily medical reports. The cub had begun eating solids. Suri's blood work showed improvement, but something else had shifted too. Something beyond data. Word had spread. A field camera captured the moment Suri had approached Ava for help, wounded and desperate. The footage was shared by the sanctuary's education team, intended for awareness, but no one expected what followed. The video went viral. Millions saw the image of a wild bear, eyes dim with pain, slowly limping toward a lone woman in the woods. No aggression, no fear, just trust. People were stunned. News stations called it a miracle. Scientists called it unprecedented behavior. Commentators debated whether Suri's actions were a fluke or a glimpse into the complexity of animal intelligence and emotional perception. But for Ava, it wasn't a question. This wasn't instinct. This was choice. Suri had chosen to find help, not for herself, but for her cub. And she'd chosen a human to give that plea to. That meant something. At the Sanctuary Visitor Center, guests now stopped in front of a modest display. It wasn't flashy, just a metal snare, the actual trap found, tangled in the cub's leg, enclosed in glass. Beside it, a small sign read, "This should never have been in a forest." But this mother's strength, and one ranger's compassion, turned a trap into a turning point. Ava's voice had reached policymakers too. With the help of the sanctuary team, she drafted a report calling for stricter enforcement against illegal wildlife traps, more funding for field patrols, and better legislation protecting mother-offspring species in vulnerable migration zones. And for the first time in her life, Ava received a call she never expected from the country's Minister of Environmental Protection. They wanted her to testify, to tell the story, not just of what happened, but why it mattered. She agreed, not because of the attention, but because of what Suri had done. That bear had walked out of the forest and asked a human for help. The least Ava could do was speak. For her, when the world was finally listening. Back at the enclosure, Ava crouched near the fence. Suri stood up slowly, padding toward her with the cub trailing behind. The little one pressed against its mother's legs, peeking out with curiosity. Suri didn't growl. She didn't flinch. She looked straight at Ava, calm and watchful. Ava smiled and placed her hand gently on the fence. You gave everything to protect your child, and somehow, even when you were breaking, you knew someone would be there. Suri blinked, her deep eyes reflecting light like still water. Then, just as before, she turned and walked back toward the forest edge of the enclosure, her cub skipping behind. Ava stayed there for a while, thinking of all the times humans had failed wildlife, of all the harm done in the name of ignorance or greed. But not this time. This time, something different happened. A wounded mother bear, choosing not to run, but to trust. A ranger, choosing not to fear, but to help. And a cub, who would live to grow strong because of both. In a world too often divided, between wild and human, this was a moment of connection, a reminder that compassion wasn't weakness, it was strength in its purest form. And sometimes it's the animals who show us the way back to what matters most.